The warning came at dawn, when Earth's deep space sensors detected something massive entering the outer edge of the solar system. Captain Jake Morrison was drinking his morning coffee aboard the USS Liberty when the alarm bells started ringing through every corridor of the ship. He dropped his cup and ran toward the bridge, while crew members rushed to their stations with faces pale and eyes wide. With sudden fear, the Zalathi had arrived. For 300 years, these aliens had swept across the galaxy like a plague that nothing could stop. Every world they encountered received the same message, and every world made the same choice: surrender or die. 12 species had already fallen to their endless armada, and not one had chosen to fight. The stories from refugee ships were all the same. Massive vessels appearing in orbit, weapons that could crack planets. Entire populations taken as slaves while their cities burned to ash and dust. Jake reached the bridge and looked at the main display screen. His blood went cold. 12 enormous ships hung in the darkness of space just beyond Neptune's orbit. Each one was 5 times larger than anything humanity had ever built. Their hulls were black as midnight and covered with weapons that glowed with an eerie blue light. They looked like floating cities designed for one purpose only: destruction. Admiral Kate Phillips appeared on the communication screen from Luna Command. Her face was calm, but Jake could see the tension in her jaw. Behind her, the command center was chaos, with officers shouting reports and technicians working frantically at their stations. "All ships report in," she said, and her voice cut through the noise. "We need a full count of what we have." The reports came in one by one. 47 ships total, 20 destroyers, 15 cruisers, 8 frigates, 4 carriers, against 12 Zalathi dreadnoughts that had conquered half the known galaxy. Jake did the math in his head and didn't like the answer. They were so badly outnumbered it almost seemed funny, except nothing about this situation was funny at all. Commander Lisa Hayes stood next to Jake, studying the sensor data with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had spent months reviewing every piece of information they could gather from the species that had fallen to the Zalathi. Battle recordings, tactical reports, survivor testimonies, all of it painted the same picture. The Zalathi showed up, made their demands, and everyone surrendered within hours, Captain, Lisa said quietly so only Jake could hear. They have never faced real resistance. Every species gave up before the shooting even started. Jake looked at her and understood what she meant. The Zalathi were used to easy victories. They expected fear and submission. They had probably forgotten what an actual battle felt like. The alien broadcast began exactly on schedule. The Zalathi were nothing if not precise. The voice that came through every speaker in the fleet was cold and mechanical, like a computer reading a script it had read 1,000 times before. "Primitive species of the third planet, you will submit to the Zalathi Collective. Your military forces will power down and await boarding. Your governments will surrender authority. Your population will be processed for incorporation. You have 24 hours to comply. Resistance will result in planetary sterilization." The message repeated in 6 different Earth languages. Someone had done their homework. The Zalathi had been watching humanity for long enough to learn how to speak to them. That thought made Jake's skin crawl. Admiral Phillips let the message finish before responding. When she spoke, her voice carried across every channel to every ship in the fleet. "This is Admiral Kate Phillips of the United Earth Space Command. To all human vessels and personnel, we have a choice to make right now. We can surrender and hope the Zalathi are merciful. We can kneel and accept chains. Or we can stand and fight." She paused, and Jake saw her take a deep breath. "I won't lie to anyone. The odds are terrible. We are outgunned and outnumbered. Most of us probably won't see tomorrow. But I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. I would rather burn in space than watch Earth become a slave world. If any ship wants to withdraw, I will not judge them. But the rest of us are going to show these bastards what it means to fight humanity." For a long moment there was silence on the fleet channels. Jake held his breath. Then one by one the responses came in. USS Constitution standing ready. USS Defiance reports ready for battle. USS Ranger requesting permission to lead the first attack. All 47 ships. Every single one. Not one captain chose to run. Jake felt something swell in his chest. Pride maybe, or fear. Or both mixed together so tightly he couldn't tell them apart. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Parker worked at the tactical station, pulling apart the sensor readings of the Zalathi ships. His fingers flew across the controls while he muttered to himself. After 10 minutes he looked up with something almost like a smile. Captain, I found something. These ships are built for intimidation, not maneuverability. Look at the mass distribution. Look at the engine placement. They are designed to look scary and hit hard, but they turn like drunk elephants. Their weapons are devastating, but the recharge time is nearly 40 seconds between shots. Jake moved to stand behind Ryan and studied the data. The kid was right. The Zealothi ships were slow, built for overwhelming firepower against enemies that didn't fight back, but against ships that could dodge and weave and strike from unexpected angles. Maybe they had a chance. A small chance, but still a chance. Get this data to every ship in the fleet, Jake ordered, and start working on attack patterns. I want plans that use our speed against their size. Across the fleet, similar conversations were happening. Engineer Tony Martinez aboard the Liberty was already rerouting power systems. Chief Weapons Officer Amy Rodriguez on the Defiance was calculating firing solutions. Dr. Ellen Foster was running simulations on her computers. 47 ships full of humans doing what humans did best. Adapting, planning, preparing to fight against impossible odds. The Zealothi waited in the darkness beyond Neptune, silent and patient and utterly confident. They had done this so many times before. They knew how it would end. Humanity would see their ships and understand the futility of resistance. Humanity would surrender like all the others. But the Zealothi had never encountered humanity before. They had conquered species that valued survival above all else. They had faced civilizations that chose logic over passion. They had defeated aliens who calculated odds and accepted reality. They had never met anyone who looked at impossible odds and decided to fight anyway. The 24-hour deadline passed in silence, and the Zealothi fleet began moving toward the inner solar system with slow and deliberate precision. Captain Jake Morrison watched them advance on the tactical display, while his hands gripped the armrests of his command chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The enemy formation was perfect and orderly, with each massive ship positioned exactly where their tactics demanded. They moved like they had done this a million times before because they had. Admiral Kate Phillips coordinated the human fleet from Luna Command with calm efficiency that hid the fear Jake knew she must be feeling. The battle plan was risky and relied entirely on speed and unpredictability. Human ships would attack in small groups from multiple directions at once. They would strike fast and pull back before the Zealothi could bring their massive weapons to bear. Hit and run, strike and fade, use their size against them. All ships form up, Kate ordered, and 47 vessels began moving into position. Remember the plan. Stay mobile. Don't give them a stable target. Make every shot count because we won't get many chances. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Parker coordinated the tactical data sharing between ships, while his screen filled with targeting information and flight paths. Every captain had access to the same sensor readings and the same attack vectors. They would move as individuals but fight as one unified force. The Zealothi broke their silence with another broadcast. The voice sounded almost bored, like this was just another routine conquest that would be over within the hour. Final warning to human vessels. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. Continued resistance will be met with immediate destruction. Your species will be held responsible for forcing us to use lethal force. Captain Amy Rodriguez aboard the USS Defiance was the first to respond, and her voice carried pure Defiance. This is the Defiance, and we live up to our name. Come and take us if you can. Her ship broke formation and accelerated directly toward the Zealothi line, with 5 other destroyers following close behind. The enemy fleet barely had time to react before the human ships were among them, weaving between the massive dreadnoughts like birds flying through a forest. Their weapons fired in rapid succession, hitting the same target points that Ryan had identified as potentially weak. The Zealothi fired back, but their massive plasma cannons were too slow to track the fast-moving human ships. Shot after shot missed by hundreds of meters while the destroyers danced through the gaps in their formation. Amy's tactical computer calculated angles that no Zealothi commander had ever considered, because no enemy had ever dared to get this close. Then engineer Tony Martinez sprang his surprise. He had spent the last 20 hours modifying the Liberty's weapons to overload their power systems for short bursts. The safety protocols screamed warnings, but Tony ignored them all. When the Liberty fired her main cannons, the beams were 3 times more powerful than their normal output. The cost was brutal on the ship's systems, but the result was spectacular. The Zealothi dreadnought Eternal Dominion took 7 overcharged shots directly to its reactor shielding in the span of 4 seconds. The shields held for the first 3 hits, flickered on the fourth and fifth, failed completely on the sixth. The seventh shot punched through the hull and into the reactor core. The explosion lit up the darkness like a second sun. The Eternal Dominion broke apart in a cascade of fire and debris that spread across 1,000 kilometers of space. Pieces of the once mighty ship tumbled through the void while secondary explosions rippled through its dying hull. Every human ship went silent for a heartbeat. Every crew member stared at their screens in disbelief. They had destroyed a Zalathi dreadnought. Something that had seemed impossible just moments ago had actually happened. Then Captain Ben Rogers of the USS Ranger broke the silence with a whoop of pure joy. That's one down. 11 to go. All ships pressed the attack. The human fleet surged forward with renewed fury. The psychological impact of seeing the enemy bleed was impossible to measure, but Jake felt it in his bones. They could win this. Against all logic and all odds, they might actually win this. The Zalathi fleet reacted with confusion that bordered on panic. Commander Vextar aboard the flagship Worldbreaker transmitted urgent messages to his subordinate vessels, but his tactical doctrine had no answer for enemies that refused to act predictably. The humans were supposed to surrender. Every species surrendered. That was how this worked. That was how it always worked. Communications Officer Danny Chen intercepted fragments of Zalathi communications and ran them through the translation software. The results were fascinating. The enemy commanders were arguing with each other. Some wanted to retreat and call for reinforcements. Others demanded they press forward and crush the humans through sheer firepower. Their unity was fracturing. Chief Engineer Sarah Kim worked in the bowels of the Liberty with her team modifying torpedo warheads on the fly. She added chemical compounds that human weapons designers had theorized might interact badly with Zalathi energy shields. There was no time for proper testing, so they just loaded them into the launch tubes and hoped for the best. The modified torpedoes proved devastatingly effective. When they impacted Zalathi shields, the chemical reaction created feedback loops that overloaded the defensive systems. 3 more dreadnoughts found their shields, failing under sustained torpedo bombardment while human ships swarmed around them like angry hornets. Jake watched the battle unfold with a mixture of pride and horror. They were winning, but the cost was mounting. The USS Defender took a direct hit from a plasma cannon and vanished in a ball of fire. The USS Valor lost its engine section and drifted helplessly while the crew evacuated in escape pods. The USS Guardian sacrificed itself to save 2 other ships by ramming a Zalathi vessel that was lining up a killing shot. 18 human ships were gone now. 18 crews that had chosen to fight rather than surrender. Jake said a silent prayer for them all while keeping his eyes locked on the tactical display. He couldn't afford to mourn yet, not while the battle still raged. Admiral Phillips coordinated reinforcement waves and ammunition distribution with the efficiency of a chess master moving pieces across a board. She pulled damaged ships back and rotated fresh vessels into the fight. She redirected fire support to ships in trouble and repositioned the fleet to maintain the chaotic, unpredictable attack pattern that was their only advantage. The second Zalathi dreadnought died when Captain Rodriguez led a coordinated strike that overwhelmed its defenses from 4 directions simultaneously. The third fell to a sustained bombardment that lasted 7 minutes and exhausted the ammunition reserves of 5 human ships. Each victory came at terrible cost, but they were victories nonetheless. Commander Vextar finally understood what he was facing. These humans fought with a fury that made no logical sense. They accepted casualties that should have broken their morale. They adapted their tactics in real time, while his own forces struggled to respond to situations their training had never prepared them for. For the first time in 300 years of conquest, the Zalathi were genuinely afraid. 3 Zalathi dreadnoughts burned in the cold vacuum of space, and their wreckage spread across the battlefield, like monuments to the impossible. Commander Vextar stood on the bridge of the Worldbreaker and stared at the tactical display with something his species had not felt in centuries: doubt. The primitive humans were supposed to collapse after the first exchange of fire. They were supposed to see the futility of resistance and beg for mercy. Instead, they fought harder with each passing moment, and their tactics grew more creative and more deadly. Captain Jake Morrison knew the human fleet was running on borrowed time. 21 ships remained operational out of the original 47. Ammunition was down to 30% across the board. Several vessels were running on emergency power after taking glancing hits from Zalathi weapons. But morale was somehow higher than ever because they had proven the enemy could bleed. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Parker worked his tactical station with hands that shook from exhaustion and too much caffeine. He had been awake for 36 hours straight, analyzing enemy patterns and developing new attack strategies. His latest discovery made him sit up straight despite his fatigue. "Captain, I found something," Ryan said, and his voice cracked with excitement. "The Zalathi ships have a blind spot. Their sensor arrays are positioned for detecting threats from standard orbital approach vectors. But if we come at them from below the plane of the eclipse at a steep angle, they won't see us until we're right on top of them." Jake studied the data and felt a grin spread across his face. It was exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that kept giving humanity an edge. The Zalathi tactical doctrine was rigid and predictable because it had always worked before. They had no experience adapting to enemies who refused to follow the rules. Captain Ben Rogers received the new tactical data aboard the USS Ranger and immediately saw the opportunity. His ship still had full missile loadouts and his crew was fresh compared to some of the other vessels. He plotted a course that would take them far below the battlefield, and then back up at an angle no sane pilot would normally attempt. "All crew strap in tight," Ben announced over the ship-wide channel. "We're about to do something really stupid." The Ranger dove away from the battle and accelerated hard toward the south pole of the solar system. The Zalathi sensors tracked it briefly, then dismissed it as a retreating vessel. Their mistake. Ben pushed the engines past their rated limits and the ship shook with the strain. When he judged the position was right, he yanked the controls hard and sent the Ranger climbing, at a 60-degree angle back toward the enemy fleet. They came up directly beneath a Zalathi dreadnought that had no idea they were there, until the Ranger unleashed its full missile payload at point-blank range. 48 missiles slammed into the enemy's unshielded lower hull in rapid succession. The dreadnought's armor held against the first dozen hits, cracked on the next 20, shattered completely on the final barrage. Internal explosions ripped through 3 decks before the ship's automated systems could contain the damage. The Zalathi fleet reacted with confusion that bordered on panic. Enemies were supposed to attack from predictable vectors. This human tendency to strike from impossible angles was deeply disturbing to tactical minds that valued order and precision above all else. Admiral Kate Phillips watched the battle from Luna Command and saw the opening they needed. The enemy formation was fracturing as individual ships tried to protect themselves from attacks that could come from any direction. Their strength had been their coordinated firepower, but now they were fighting as separate units instead of one unified fleet. "All ships focus fire on the damaged dreadnought," Kate ordered. "Bring it down before they can regroup." 6 human vessels converged on the wounded Zalathi ship and pounded it with everything they had left. Engineer Sarah Kim aboard the Liberty had prepared a special surprise for this moment. Her team had been working on a new torpedo variant that carried an experimental plasma warhead reverse, engineered from captured Zalathi technology. The weapon was unstable and might explode in the launch tube, but Sarah figured they had nothing to lose at this point. The plasma torpedo launched successfully and streaked toward the damaged dreadnought, trailing fire like a comet. When it hit the already weakened hull, the result exceeded every optimistic projection. The plasma ate through the ship's internal structure like acid through paper. Secondary explosions rippled from bow to stern. Within 90 seconds, the 4th Zalathi dreadnought was nothing but expanding debris. Commander Vexitar transmitted an emergency message to the Zalathi High Command, requesting immediate reinforcements. The response came back within minutes, and it was not what he wanted to hear. No reinforcements were available. He was ordered to complete the conquest with existing forces. Failure was unacceptable. The reputation of the Zalathi Empire could not be damaged by primitive humans. Communications Officer Danny Chen continued monitoring enemy transmissions, and the fragments he intercepted painted a picture of an opponent in crisis. The Zalathi commanders were arguing over tactics. Some wanted to maintain formation. Others advocated for spreading out to prevent being flanked. A few suggested retreat to regroup and reassess. Their unity of command was breaking down. Captain Amy Rodriguez pushed the Defiance through a series of impossible maneuvers that would have made any sane pilot sick. She used the gravity well of Mars to slingshot around the planet and come at the enemy fleet from an angle they never anticipated. Her weapons officer had time to fire exactly 3 shots before they were past the target, but all 3 shots hit critical systems. The battle had been raging for 8 hours, and both sides were exhausted. Human crews operated on adrenaline and determination, while Zalathi commanders struggled to understand how their perfect conquest had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical combat. Every human victory reinforced the message that the Zalathi were not invincible. Every Zalathi loss shook their confidence further. Dr. Ellen Foster worked in her lab aboard the Liberty running calculations on her quantum computer. She was a physicist, not a warrior, but her work might prove more important than any weapon. She had been studying the Zalathi faster than light drives and found something interesting. Their technology created a specific quantum signature that human sensors could detect. More importantly, she had a theory about how to disrupt that signature and trap enemy ships in normal space. Jake received Ellen's preliminary report and forwarded it immediately to Admiral Phillips. If they could prevent the Zalathi from escaping to hyperspace, the enemy would be forced to either win or die. No retreat. No calling for help. A final confrontation that would decide everything. Engineer Tony Martinez brought his concerns to Jake about the Liberty's condition. The ship had taken damage from near misses, and the weapons overload modifications were degrading critical systems faster than anticipated. They might have enough power for one more major engagement before everything shut down. How long can we keep fighting? Jake asked quietly. Tony looked at his readouts and shook his head. Maybe 2 more hours at current combat intensity. After that, we'll be drifting. Jake nodded and made his decision. 2 hours was enough. It had to be enough. They would throw everything they had left at the enemy and pray it was sufficient. There was no plan beyond that. No fallback position. No safety net. They would win in the next 2 hours or humanity would face extinction. The Zalathi fleet began reforming into a defensive sphere with the World Breaker at the center. Commander Vexistar had abandoned his conquest doctrine and adopted pure survival tactics. His mission to subjugate humanity was secondary now to just staying alive long enough to escape this nightmare. The Zalathi defensive sphere was a wall of overlapping fire zones and interlocked shields that had never been broken by any enemy in 300 years of conquest. 8 dreadnoughts remained, and they positioned themselves with mathematical precision to cover every possible attack vector. Commander Vextar felt his confidence returning as he watched the formation solidify. The humans had fought well, but now they would break themselves against proper Zalathi military doctrine. Captain Jake Morrison studied the enemy formation from the bridge of the Liberty and knew they were looking at their own graves. The human fleet was down to 19 operational ships. Most were damaged. All were low on ammunition. The crew was exhausted beyond measure. But surrender was not even discussed because every person aboard every ship understood what was at stake. Earth, humanity, freedom itself. Admiral Kate Phillips opened a private channel to Jake, and her face on the screen showed the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest," she said quietly. "Can the Liberty make one more attack run?" Jake looked around his bridge at the sparking consoles and flickering lights. He thought about Tony Martinez down in engineering holding the ship together with wire and prayers. He thought about the crew who had given everything they had and were being asked to give more. "Yes, ma'am," Jake said without hesitation. "We can make one more run." Kate nodded slowly, and Jake saw something in her eyes that made his stomach drop. She had a plan, and it was going to cost them everything. "I'm authorizing Final Contingency Alpha," Kate said, and those words made every senior officer in the fleet go quiet. Final Contingency Alpha was the last resort, the option nobody wanted to use. A suicide attack designed to cripple the enemy even if it meant certain death for whoever carried it out. The Liberty would fly directly into the heart of the Zalathi formation and detonate its antimatter fuel reserves. The explosion would be catastrophic enough to destroy or cripple every enemy ship within 1,000 kilometers. But the Liberty and its crew would be vaporized instantly. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. He had volunteered for many dangerous missions in his career, but this was different. This was not danger. This was certainty. Death was not a possibility. It was the entire point. "I understand, Admiral," Jake said, and his voice was steady despite the fear climbing up his throat. "The Liberty will execute Final Contingency Alpha." Before Kate could respond, Engineer Tony Martinez interrupted on the internal channel, and his voice carried excitement that seemed wildly out of place given their situation. "Captain, I need you in engineering." "Right now," Tony said. "Dr. Foster and I figured something out." Jake ran from the bridge with Commander Lisa Hayes following close behind. They found Tony and Ellen hunched over a computer display that showed complex quantum equations Jake could barely understand. But he understood the smile on Ellen's face, and that gave him hope. "We can trap them," Ellen said without any preamble. "The Zalathi use quantum tunneling for their faster-than-light drives. I found a way to create a localized quantum disruption field that will lock down their drives. They won't be able to jump to hyperspace." "That's great, but how does it help us?" Jake asked. Tony pointed at another screen showing the Liberty's power systems. "We can use the ship's experimental quantum drive as the source for the disruption field, but it requires overloading the drive beyond any safety limit. The ship will be caught in a temporal anomaly. Time will loop for everything within the field radius." Jake understood immediately. "We trap ourselves along with the enemy. Buy time for the rest of the fleet to finish them off." "Exactly," Ellen said. "The loop will last approximately 47 minutes from an outside perspective. For us inside, it will feel like we're living the same moment over and over. We won't remember the loops. We'll just suddenly find ourselves 47 minutes in the future, with the enemy fleet disabled." It was still a one-way trip. The Liberty would be destroyed by the quantum overload, but the crew might survive if they evacuated before the final moment. It was a chance. A slim one, but better than the certainty of antimatter annihilation. Jake made his decision in seconds. "Do it. Prep the overload sequence and get me a timeline. I need to inform the crew." He returned to the bridge and opened a ship-wide channel. Every crew member on the Liberty stopped what they were doing to listen. "This is the captain," Jake said. "We have been given a mission that will likely destroy this ship. We're going to fly into the enemy formation and create a quantum disruption that will trap their fleet. The rest of our forces will use that time to finish them off. I'm ordering a full evacuation. All crew to escape pods." "That's not a request. That's a direct order." He paused and took a deep breath. "It's been an honor serving with all of you. Now get off my ship." The crew moved with disciplined efficiency toward the escape pods, but Jake noticed several key personnel were not evacuating. Tony remained in engineering. Ellen stayed at her lab station. Ryan Parker sat at his tactical console. Lisa Hayes stood next to the captain's chair with her arms crossed. "I believe I gave an order," Jake said quietly. "Yes, sir," Lisa replied, "and I'm choosing to ignore it. Someone needs to fly this ship, and you can't do it alone." Tony's voice came over the intercom. "Engineering staying put, Captain. You'll need someone to manage the quantum overload manually." Ellen chimed in next. "I'm not leaving either. This is my theory, and I need to see it through." One by one, other crew members reported that they were staying. Navigation, weapons, communications, shields. They all refused to abandon ship. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't afford to show. "You're all idiots," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only pride. The Liberty broke formation and accelerated toward the Zalathi defensive sphere. Every remaining human ship provided covering fire to give them a clear path. Captain Amy Rodriguez led a desperate attack on the enemy's eastern flank to draw their attention. Captain Ben Rogers brought the Ranger in from above to split their focus further. The Zalathi fleet recognized the Liberty as a threat and concentrated fire on the approaching ship. Plasma bolts and energy beams filled the space around them. Jake's hands flew across the controls, dodging and weaving through the barrage. The ship shuddered with each near miss. Alarms screamed from every station, but they kept flying forward into the teeth of enemy fire. "Quantum drive at critical," Tony reported. "Overload in 30 seconds. Jake guided the Liberty through the final approach. They were inside the Zalathi formation, now surrounded by massive dreadnoughts on all sides. The perfect position. The Worldbreaker loomed directly ahead, and Jake could see weapons ports opening along its hull. 20 seconds to overload. Tony counted down. 15, 10. Commander Vexitar watched the human ship approaching and finally understood what they intended. These insane primitives were going to destroy themselves just to take the Zalathi fleet down with them. The thought was incomprehensible, but he recognized the determination in their flight path. They would not stop. They would not turn away. They would die to ensure their species survived. For the first time in his long military career, Vexitar felt genuine respect for an enemy. 5 seconds, Tony called out. 3, 2, 1. The Liberty's quantum drive exploded into cascading failure, and reality itself seemed to tear apart around them. Space and time twisted into impossible shapes. The Zalathi fleet found their drives locked down and their systems going haywire. They were trapped in a bubble of distorted space-time with no way to escape. Jake saw the moment freeze and repeat and freeze again as the temporal loop took hold. Then everything went white. Captain Jake Morrison opened his eyes and found himself still alive, which was the first surprise. The second surprise was that he was lying in a medical bay aboard the USS Ranger instead of floating dead in space. His head pounded like someone had used it as a drum, and his memories of the last hour were fragmented and confusing. He remembered flying the Liberty into the enemy formation. He remembered the quantum drive overload beginning. Then nothing but white light and a sensation of falling through infinite darkness. A nurse noticed he was awake and immediately called for the doctor. Within minutes, Captain Ben Rogers walked into the medical bay with a grin on his face that looked completely out of place, given the circumstances of their last meeting. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Ben said and pulled up a chair next to Jake's bed. "You've been out for 6 hours. Missed all the excitement." Jake tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. "What happened? Where's my ship? Where's my crew?" Ben's grin faded slightly. "The Liberty is gone. The quantum overload tore her apart. But your crew got out. All of them. The temporal loop gave us enough time to close in and launch rescue shuttles. We pulled everyone out of the wreckage before the ship finally broke up." Relief flooded through Jake so intensely he felt tears prick at his eyes. His crew was alive. Tony and Ellen and Lisa and Ryan and all the others. They had survived. "The Zalathi?" Jake asked after he got his emotions under control. Ben's grin returned full force. "Surrendered. All of them. The temporal loop disabled their systems completely. By the time they got free, we had them surrounded with every gun we had pointed at their heads. Commander Vextar transmitted an unconditional surrender about 3 hours ago." Jake stared at Ben in disbelief. "They surrendered? The Zalathi actually surrendered? First time in their entire history, apparently," Ben said. "Vextar is asking to meet with Admiral Phillips. Says he needs to understand what happened here." 2 days later, Jake stood in a conference room aboard what remained of the human fleet and watched Commander Vextar enter, escorted by armed guards. The Zalathi commander was tall and thin with gray skin and 4 arms. His face was difficult to read, but Jake thought he detected something like confusion in the alien's large dark eyes. Admiral Kate Phillips sat at the head of the table with her senior officers around her. The room was silent as Vextar took his seat across from them. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then the Zalathi commander broke the silence. "I do not understand your species," Vextar said, and his translator device rendered his words in perfect English. "We have conquered 47 worlds across 300 years. Every species chose survival when faced with superior force. This is logical. This is rational. But you chose death instead. You flew damaged ships against overwhelming firepower. You sacrificed vessels to save others. You destroyed yourselves to trap us. Why?" Kate looked at the alien commander with eyes that had seen too much death in too short a time. "Because some things are worth dying for. Freedom, our homes, our families. We will not live as slaves no matter how logical surrender might seem." Vextar's translator was silent for several seconds, as if struggling to process concepts that had no equivalent in Zalathi language. "You made us afraid. In 3 centuries of conquest, we have never experienced fear of an enemy. But your species fights with such fury that logic fails. You are either insane or possess something we lost long ago." "We're not insane," Jake said quietly. "We're just human. And humans don't kneel." The conference ended with terms that shocked the galaxy. The Zalathi would withdraw from human space immediately. More than that, they would abandon every world they had conquered and return to their home territory. Vextar agreed to these terms without negotiation because he understood that humanity had broken something fundamental in the Zalathi Empire. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. If primitive humans could defeat them, then any species could. News of the Battle of Sol spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Refugee ships carried the story to every corner of known space. The Zalathi had been defeated. The impossible had happened. A small fleet of human ships had stood against the terror of the galaxy and won on 100 enslaved worlds. The news sparked something that had been dormant for generations: hope, rebellion, the memory that freedom was worth fighting for. Within weeks, uprisings began on Zalathi-occupied planets. Within months, the Empire was fighting on a dozen fronts of species that had surrendered. Decades ago, suddenly remembered how to resist. Dr. Ellen Foster spent months analyzing the data from the quantum disruption, and her findings revolutionized human understanding of faster-than-light physics. The temporal loop had been a desperate gamble, but it opened doors to technology humanity had never imagined possible. Her work would eventually lead to quantum communication systems and improved ship drives that made human vessels the fastest in the galaxy. Engineer Tony Martinez became a legend among spacecraft designers. His weapon modifications and creative engineering solutions were studied at every military academy. Young engineers wanted to know how he had kept the Liberty flying long enough to complete its mission. Tony always gave the same answer: stubbornness and duct tape. Captain Amy Rodriguez received command of a new ship built specifically for the fast attack tactics she had pioneered. The USS Defiant II became the flagship of humanity's rapid response fleet. Other species studied her battle recordings and marveled at the aggressive creativity of human tactical thinking. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Parker was promoted and given his own ship at an age younger than any captain in fleet history. His ability to find weaknesses in enemy formations made him invaluable. As humanity began exploring beyond their own territory and encountering new alien species, both friendly and hostile, Admiral Kate Phillips retired after the war and wrote a book about the battle that became required reading for every officer in the fleet. She titled it simply The Stand and dedicated it to the crews of the 28 ships that were lost in the fight. Her final chapter discussed the price of freedom and why some costs must be paid no matter how terrible they seem. Jake Morrison recovered from his injuries and returned to active duty as captain of the USS Liberty II, built from the salvaged parts of his original ship. He carried a piece of the old Liberty's hull plating in his quarters as a reminder of what his crew had been willing to sacrifice. When young officers asked him about the battle, he always told them the same thing. Humanity won not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they refused to give up even when giving up was the logical choice. Commander Vextar returned to the Zalathi homeworld and spent the rest of his life trying to explain to his people what he had witnessed. The concept of fighting against impossible odds for abstract ideals like freedom was so alien to Zalathi thinking that most dismissed his reports as exaggeration or trauma-induced delusion. But a few young Zalathi listened and wondered if perhaps their species had lost something important when they chose conquest over all other values. The Galactic Liberation War raged for 5 years as enslaved species rose up against their Zalathi oppressors. Human ships fought alongside dozens of alien allies, teaching them the tactics that had won the Battle of Sol. The war was brutal and costly, but when it ended, the Zalathi Empire was reduced to a fraction of its former size, and dozens of species were free for the first time in generations. Historians would debate for centuries why humanity succeeded where others failed. Some argued it was their isolation that forced them to develop advanced military technology. Others claimed it was their fractured history of constant warfare that taught them adaptability. A few suggested it was something in human psychology that valued freedom above survival. But the veterans of the Battle of Sol knew the real answer. Humanity won because when faced with the choice between chains and death, they chose death. And that willingness to die for freedom was exactly what it took to live free. The galaxy learned that day that some species would rather burn than bow, that some flames could not be extinguished by any amount of force, that the human spirit, when pushed to its limit, would push back twice as hard. The name Liberty became sacred among free peoples across the galaxy. It represented not just a ship, but an idea that tyranny could be defeated if beings were brave enough to stand against it. And whenever oppression threatened to overwhelm resistance fighters on distant worlds, they would remember the 47 human ships that faced impossible odds and won. They would remember that freedom is never given. It is only taken by those with the courage to fight for it.